What's up, guys? This is VinylicPuma, back with another Borderlands History countdown video, and today I wanted to go over 10 of what I think are among some of the worst rocket launchers in the entire Borderlands series. Now, before we start, I'd like to thank you all for supporting this series so far. It's something some of my longtime subscribers have been requesting for quite a while now, and I'm glad to have finally brought it to you. I will likely revisit this series at some point in the future. After all, we're still waiting for Borderlands 3 to come out, but for now, I want to go ahead and try some new things. But with all of that out of the way, I am pleased to present 10 of what I think are among some of the worst rocket launchers in Borderlands history, starting now. Number 10. Spread/burst fire launchers from Borderlands 1. While this inclusion will be somewhat controversial, I've got to say that I'm not really a huge fan of burst fire rocket launchers. This mostly comes down to the fact that burst fire launchers require the player to consume multiple ammo per trigger pull, potentially wasting ammo, especially if you're going up against weaker enemies that can usually be taken out in 1 or 2 rockets. I also don't like these burst fire launchers' accuracy over long range. While the initial rocket is usually accurate, the subsequent rockets almost never are, meaning that there's a possibility of having quite a few rockets miss. Ultimately, I think you could probably do a lot worse than these in Borderlands 1. However, I'd personally rather have a rocket launcher that fires a little slower, isn't burst fire, and in general is just a heck of a lot more accurate. Still, I suppose some people may like the quick barrage of rockets for their decent DPS potential, and if you want a burst fire launcher, like all other non-unique weapons, you can acquire these from any suitable loot source. Number 9. The E-Tech Plasma Cannon from Borderlands 2. So this will be another controversial inclusion, however, I've got to say that I'm not really that much of a fan of the E-Tech Bandit launcher. Why? Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that the plasma cannon lacks one of the best aspects of E-Tech launchers, and that is the special blue orb cataclysm effect that you might see on something like the Norfleet. Instead, you get this interesting carpet bomb ability that allows the plasma cannon to deploy multiple bomb-like rockets as the initial projectile travels through the air. Oddly, these bomb-like rockets deal explosive damage rather than the element that the plasma cannon spawned with, which I kind of find fairly inconvenient, as you're likely to be using a specific element plasma cannon when going up against certain enemies. With all of this said though, the plasma cannon does have a fairly decent projectile multiplier, and the ammo consumption is fairly reasonable as well. Of course, while the ammo consumption isn't as good as most other bandit launchers, and the Norfleet itself is almost twice as powerful and has the cataclysm effect, things could certainly be a lot worse for the plasma cannon. After all, if this launcher consumed 3 ammo per shot and had no projectile multiplier at all, it would be unbelievably terrible. If you want a plasma cannon, you're going to have to get lucky and acquire one from any suitable loot source. However, I'd rather just about have any other E-Tech launcher. Number 8. The Rhino launcher from Borderlands 1. The Rhino is a rocket launcher that would seem like it would be a good idea, however, it's actually pretty terrible in practice. What this launcher does is fires a projectile that explodes periodically as it travels through the air, potentially allowing one to not only deal damage from the initial rocket, but also from these periodic explosions. In a sense, it's a lot like the Pyro and Cryophobia launchers, which we're going to get into later on in this video. The problem with these periodic explosions is that it's really difficult to get them to hit enemies. After all, you have to properly distance yourself and then fire slightly to the side of an enemy, potentially wasting a rocket in the process. Now, maybe it's just me, but I'd rather have a rocket launcher that focuses on and rewards me for firing directly at an enemy target, rather than firing to the sides of it, potentially wasting ammo. In the Rhino's defense, it does have the benefits of coming in every element, meaning that it could feasibly be used in a variety of situations. However, I think you'll find that the over-reliance on indirect fire to really take advantage of its damage potential is definitely a problem. Like other Borderlands 1 legendaries though, the Rhino can be obtained from any suitable loot source. However, I think you'll just find that you'd rather have a non-unique launcher, the Nidhogg, or the Undertaker, as all of these are just far better rocket launchers from Borderlands 1. Number 7. The Mongol launcher from Borderlands 1. Now, originally, I kinda didn't want to put this on the list for a couple of reasons. After all, the Mongol is the only legendary launcher that's been in all 3 of the games, and it's also worth mentioning that both the Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel variants of the Mongol are quite good. However, I think the Borderlands 1 variant of the Mongol just leaves a lot to be desired. If you're familiar with the Mongol, it spawns more rockets as the projectile travels through the air. However, unlike the Borderlands 2 or the pre-sequel variants, where you get dozens of rockets that spawn every time you fire, the Borderlands 1 version is very stingy in this particular area. Maybe it's just me, but with the Borderlands 1 variant of the Mongol, it feels like you're only getting 1 or 2 rockets spawning, making indirect fire with this weapon incredibly impractical. Plus, there's also the fact that the Mongol has fairly high ammo consumption in Borderlands 1, making it a poor choice provided you ended up using it as a more direct fire launcher. So what you're left with here is a weapon that simply doesn't spawn enough rockets, on top of the fact that it just consumes way too much ammo per shot. But I suppose if you want the Mongol from Borderlands 1, it can be obtained from any suitable loot source. However, I just recommend that you stick with either the Borderlands 2 or the pre-sequel versions. Number 6. The Pyrophobia launcher from Borderlands 2. So, the Pyrophobia is pretty much a worse version of Borderlands 1's Rhino that's ultimately hindered by the same obnoxious special effect, on top of the fact that the Pyrophobia can only come in fire element. At least with the Rhino, you could argue that it was a little more useful, as the ability to come in all elements ultimately made the weapon a lot more practical. However, this is ultimately something you're just not getting with the Pyrophobia. Also, another thing I think hurts the Pyrophobia is how the spacing of the explosions are tied to projectile speed, and the faster the projectiles move, the less effective the weapon gets. With this in mind, pure Pyrophobias with all metal-on parts end up being terrible, and if you add in certain character skills to the mix that also are increasing projectile speed, you're just going to have a bad time. If you want the Pyrophobia, it can be acquired from numerous sources. However, I've found the best way is to just farm Incinerator Clayton in Frostburn Canyon once the cult following the Enkindling side quest mission has been completed. You may find that you regret farming this thing though, as it is definitely one of the lesser legendary launchers from Borderlands 2. Number 5. The Cryophobia launcher from Borderlands the pre-sequel. I don't know if it's a tradition or not, but the Cryophobia is pretty much a worse version of the Pyrophobia from Borderlands 2, which is a worse version of the Rhino from Borderlands 1. While the Pyrophobia has the advantage of coming in fire element, and thus it's at least somewhat decent when going up against fire-vulnerable enemies, the Cryophobia is cryo-elemental and isn't particularly strong against anything. On top of that, what's actually valuable about the cryo element is its potential to freeze enemies in place, making them vulnerable to explosive damage and/or critical hits. By having each Cryophobia projectile deal a decent amount of damage to start, and without the high fire rate that you're going to need to apply those status effects, you may find it's difficult to really take advantage of the cryo element's ability to actually debuff enemies with the Cryophobia. In reality, if the Cryophobia came in explosive, it might actually be a lot more practical. However, due to its cryo exclusivity and cryo's purpose to debuff enemies rather than finish them, you sort of have to wonder what the point of this weapon is. But if you want the Cryophobia, it can be acquired from the Bosun in Pity's Fall. Number 4. The Thingy launcher from Borderlands the pre-sequel. The Thingy, in my humble opinion, is the worst legendary rocket launcher from the pre-sequel. Now, on the one hand, I can appreciate that the developers of the pre-sequel did something different and tried to make a bandit/scav rocket launcher that breaks from convention. On the other hand, I think we can all agree that what bandit launchers were was arguably great as is. After all, it's difficult to compete with high projectile multipliers and low ammo consumption. The Thingy, on the other hand, is essentially the total inverse of this, as it's a single projectile launcher that consumes multiple ammo per shot. Granted, you do get some homing grenade projectiles that can also deal damage. However, I think you'll find that the high ammo consumption on this launcher alone just makes the Thingy really impractical. To be fair, I suppose the thingy isn't a total disaster, as you can farm them from Iwajira and then use them to make other legendaries via the grinder in Concordia. However, I do have to admit that the weapon itself is pretty lacking, and if there is one legendary rocket launcher I'd recommend you avoid from the pre-sequel, it would definitely be the thingy launcher. Number 3. The Tunguska launcher from Borderlands 2. While the Undertaker from Borderlands 1 isn't the best rocket launcher in the series, I'd say it's the best pearlescent launcher in the series. Which is kind of ironic because the Tunguska from Borderlands 2 could potentially be one of the better launchers in the entire series. In fact, it's kind of sad as the Tunguska's problems lay in small aspects of its design, and thus it's actually possible to make the Tunguska quite powerful and useful. However, for whatever reason, Gearbox never really took the time to fix what was wrong with this gun, and that's ultimately why it's on the list. The problem with the Tunguska is sort of twofold in that it has a massive blast radius and the Tunguska's massive explosion can deal damage to the player. This requires the player to make sure that they always have a sham or some type of absorption shield equipped, as otherwise they would end up being killed by their very own gun. Of course, an easy fix would be to negate all damage the player takes from the Tunguska, and fortunately, if you're playing Borderlands 2 with the community patch installed, Shadow Evil and the rest of the community patch team have taken the time to fix the Tunguska's self-damage, and as you might guess, it actually makes the weapon far more viable and fun to use. Ultimately, I'd only recommend you use the Tunguska if you have the community patch installed, but if you want this gun, you can acquire it anywhere first-gen pearlescents are, which includes any suitable loot source, legendary loot midgets, as well as Oh My God What the Heck from the Digistruct Peak DLC. Number 2. The Bunny Launcher from Borderlands 2. Without a doubt, the Bunny is the worst legendary rocket launcher in Borderlands 2. While I suppose it's not entirely terrible when conventionally fired, the main problem with the Bunny is its obnoxious reload. The Bunny's reload causes the weapon to hop around like a bunny until it eventually explodes, and unfortunately, this reload pattern can prove to be extremely unpredictable and can actually end up getting the player killed. Especially if you're in an enclosed area like you might see in Bloodshot Stronghold, or if you're on an uneven terrain that's a lot like the rest of the entire game. I also think you'll find that the reload isn't really good at killing enemies on higher difficulties, and for whatever reason, it seems like the Bunny is just strong enough to potentially one-shot the player, while also being just weak enough to not be of much use to most tougher in-game mobs. I guess if you would like the Bunny, your best bet is going to be to get it from chubby enemies in Borderlands 2, and personally, I'd recommend you try to farm the Bunny from chubby Varkids, as these enemies can spawn from Varkid pods. But as a disclaimer, don't blame me when you try to use the Bunny and you end up losing your mind. And finally, number 1, the Redemption Launcher from Borderlands 1. What a boatload of ass! The Torg Redemption from Borderlands 1 is pretty terrible. While it may be capable of dealing high damage per projectile, the Redemption's 4 ammo per shot requirement is insanely high. In fact, for as much as I dislike burst fire rocket launchers from Borderlands 1, I even have to admit that the ability to fire rockets at the cost of 5 ammo is way better than firing just 1 rocket for 4 rocket ammo. What is even more insidious is the fact that the Redemption will even dip into your ammo pool to consume the necessary amount of rocket ammo required to fire. So, in other words, if you have 1 rocket in the magazine and 20 or so in your launcher ammo pool, you'll consume the 1 rocket in addition to 3 from your ammo pool, leaving you with 17 rockets in total. Also, it's pretty egregious that this weapon won't even fire if you have enough ammo, truly making this launcher one of the most insulting weapons in Borderlands history. I've got to say that I'm pretty glad it didn't get included in Borderlands 2 or the pre-sequel. After all, I can imagine that the Redemption would be one of the worst launchers in either game. But if you want the Redemption, it's pretty much obtained in the same way that other Borderlands 1 legendaries are, and it can be acquired from any suitable loot source. Alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you liked this video, feel free to leave a like, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload more videos, and as always, thank you all so much for supporting this channel, take care, and I'll see y'all in the next one.